Spy Family is actually the world's best parenting manual. Fight me. But in all sincerity, I found that Spy Family, behind its other profound themes, such as open spousal communication, the power of childhood innocence, and the age-old question of whether the means justify the ends, child rearing without emotional investment was the one that stood out to me the most. In other words, Spy Family is about a concept called detachment parenting, and why it's a lot more effective than people realize. And yes, the concepts we're about to look at aren't just applicable for raising sproutlings, but everything from excelling at work, to being a better significant other, to training a group of rebels in an undisclosed location to topple a foreign government. Thanks for asking. Hello Funkers, Tony Funk here, and today we're going to break down Loid Forger's arsenal as a counterintelligence operative, and why one set of particular skills helps him become a killer parent, literally I guess, and why we should all strive to learn this skill, which is why I'll explain a few techniques that we can all practice at home too. Disclaimer, they won't make you sexy and good at playing tennis, sorry. Spy Family follows the adventures of a top international spy named Twilight in an attempt to prevent a war between the nations of Westalis and Ostania, all by playing the role of a good father and husband. Though this slice-of-life anime uses East and West Germany as a template for a precarious Cold War, its largest focus seemed to lay out what a good father is and isn't. But before we get into that, let's look at what makes Loid Forger, aka Agent Twilight, a good spy. Among his many assets, his intellect, fighting skills, and ability to remain calm in stressful situations were the traits that allowed him to become Westalis' greatest spy. However, according to Tradecraft, which is an online membership group started by Tier 1 operators that educates its loser members on how to live everyday life like a spy, out of all those traits, the one that is the most important is the ability to remain calm in stressful situations. According to Tradecraft, and I quote, "Being a spy can be a very stressful profession. Not only do they have to constantly be on the lookout for danger, but they also have to maintain their cover and be careful not to let their true identity be discovered. This can take a toll on their mental and physical health. In order to cope with the stress, spies often undergo training that teaches them how to manage their emotions and stay calm under pressure." What's interesting is that Loid has been stated to have this ability to an unparalleled degree amongst his spy colleagues. This was disclosed by Agent Nightfall after she noticed that Loid's actual love for Anya and Yor was making him soft. But how do operators and spies achieve this level of calm and emotional detachment in the first place? Though a good place to explore the extremes of emotional detachment would be to do a deep dive into the horrors of Bud's Navy SEAL training. Get it? Deep dive? We're going to analyze much more accessible examples of how other stressful professions achieve this. According to an article by the Law Enforcement Bulletin, some law enforcement agencies undergo a psychoeducational course on stress management. And I quote, "Through examples and exercises, students experience what happens internally when responding to stress. They learn what the fight or flight reaction is and how it impacts their health and safety. Participants discover how different levels of stress and the resulting emotional responses can impact occupational performance in the real world. So if the first step to be an effective spy, operator, or in this specific case, cop, is identifying what triggers our fight or flight responses, then what can we do once we've identified them in order to prevent us from cracking under pressure and becoming emotionally reactive?" Well, the article answers this with the following. Officers also learn stress response techniques and practice them in the classroom. These techniques include controlled breathing to modulate fight or flight physiology, positive mental focus, and visualization. Participants also become aware of the relationship between nutrition, stress, and performance, including basic skills regarding how to eat to fuel the body for optimal performance and health. The way this is practiced in the classroom is through visualization and mock situations. And though they say you play like you train, in the world of dangerous professions such as counterintelligence or special operations, that's not always true. In order to be able to adapt to a stressful situation, one must first know what to do. The problem with this reality is that when one is under stress, information retention drops significantly when it comes to short-term memory. This means that though police officers, soldiers, spies, and other high-stress professionals have to undergo stressful training in order to practice emotional detachment, the first phase of their training has to be in controlled environments. Classroom training is important because it sets the foundations for the theoretical steps to reduce stress. We can imply then that Loid Forger started his journey to hone his skills in a classroom, being presented with an array of theoretical situations that would stress him out. In this controlled environment, he would practice his memorized emotional detachment tactics until they became automatic in mock situations. Then as the training progressed, the situations would get more and more stressful until it would become Loid Forger's knee-jerk reaction to go into stress modulation mode. This is something we should all strive for, whether we're spies or not in our daily lives. Stress modulation is an integral part of performing our duties to the best of our abilities and can literally be beneficial for all aspects of our lives. This is something that we see with top athletes too, where only the most elite can replicate their skills, even when the stakes are at their highest. But okay, we can't all have access to the type of training that Loid underwent to become Westalis' greatest spy. Before I reveal accessible tips in order to become as emotionally detached as possible in our everyday lives, let's take a look at how this skill helps Loid raise Anya better than most invested parents ever would. Anya Forger, being a telepathic troublemaker, had grown up under 4 adoptive families, causing her problematic upbringing to disadvantage her in a school setting. Due to her many weaknesses such as poor grammar, low discipline, low artistic ability, and poor management of impulsivity, she frustrates Loid whenever he needs her to perform well in school or make friends with Donovan Desmond. We can then assume that Anya's lack of discipline was the main reason she was dropped off at the orphanage thrice for not meeting her adoptive parents' expectations. Now, based on this track record, had Loid not been reliant on Anya as a crucial element of Operation Strix, and had he not developed skills to detach emotionally, statistically we could assume then that Loid would have dropped Anya off at the orphanage as well. But why is this exactly? The reason comes with a twofold answer. Emotional attachment in parenting, though very beneficial in some aspects, tends to cause 2 major issues. The first issue being that emotional attachment causes investment from the parental figure towards the child, and the second being that children pick up on the parents' emotions and thus lose confidence in their abilities to take care of them. Alright, let's explore the first element of this. Parents, whether they are conscious of it or not, invest heavily in their children's perceived success. Though this seems quite obvious, this emotional investment comes from a less obvious vector. When parents have children, they tend to gradually start to live vicariously through their children as they grow, which is a big no-no for establishing a healthy relationship with a child. According to ahaparenting.com, this is the reason our own children's choices frustrate us and cause us to lash out, and I quote, "Similarly, our kids push our buttons precisely because they are our children." Psychologists call this phenomenon ghosts in the nursery, by which they mean that our children stimulate the intense feelings of our own childhoods, and we often respond by unconsciously reenacting the past that's etched like forgotten hieroglyphs deep in our psyches. The fears and rage of childhood are powerful and can overwhelm us even as adults. It can be enormously challenging to lay these ghosts to rest. These ghosts, then, persist as long as we continue to see our children as extensions of ourselves. By placing high importance on their grades, choices, performances, etc., we start to judge our children in the same way we judge ourselves, which is usually pretty harshly. But when it came to the relationship between Anya and Loid, obviously due to Loid's intentions to use Anya as an element of his mission, he was able to avoid the ghosts in the nursery issue. This in turn allowed Loid to parent more effectively and without emotional investment. Let's take episode 3 for example. During the mission titled Prepare for the Interview, we see Loid realize that the chances of Anya to perform well during the interview are low because she grew up mostly in an orphanage and had no concept of what wealthy socialites did for leisure. Instead of getting frustrated and forcing Anya to memorize boring lies for the interview, he visualized Anya's utility for the mission and coldly concluded that the best way to get Anya to describe a representation of a classy family outing was to actually make it happen. We can note then that Loid used pragmatism as a way to encourage a positive outcome from Anya, rather than coercing her to do something against her will. Another example of this is how despite Anya's grades are consistently low, Loid provides leniency, allowing her to watch cartoons before setting limits and set appropriate times for her to study. By not allowing his emotions to do the parenting, Loid uses empathy to try to understand Anya's point of view. By understanding that Anya is only a child and that studying is a hassle for her, because of course it is, Loid reserves judgment and strategizes ways to incentivize studying. Though this may seem like common sense, the reality is that most parents use negative reinforcement to coerce their children into performing well. The issue in negative reinforcement is the crux of the secondary issue with attachment parenting. The truth is, children can sense your emotions and the repercussions of these have lasting negative effects for the rest of their lives. And not only that, it makes parenting them even more difficult in the long run. ahaparenting.com illustrates a child's perspective and reaction towards parents' emotional outbursts. And I quote, "Imagine your husband or wife losing their temper and screaming at you. Now imagine them 3 times as big as you, towering over you. Imagine that you depend on that person completely for your food, shelter, safety, and protection. Now imagine they are your primary source of love and self-confidence and information about the world, that you have nowhere else to run. Now take whatever feelings you have summoned up and magnify them by a factor of 1,000. That is something like what happens inside your child when you get angry at them. This thought experiment tells us that the expression of disappointment or anger in response to less than adequate behavior from children does not reinforce positive behavior, but rather avoidance of being reprimanded. If the primary caregiver whom the child relies on for protection, love, food, and survival shows negative reactions to certain behaviors, the child will fear the primary caregiver and will not be able to trust the caregivers when they need their help. Anya is shown throughout the series trusting both Loid and Yor whenever she finds herself in self-inflicted problems. This stems from her respect of her parents, knowing that she will be treated fairly and reprimanded within reason. We see Anya get in trouble from time to time, with Loid explaining calmly what she did wrong, and explaining what her punishment is supposed to be for her actions. This strategy of coldly explaining a punishment without showing an emotional reaction allows Anya to understand that her actions have consequences, as opposed to her actions being linked to her parents' mood. Though this following example doesn't have to do with Loid so much, we can see how Yor indicates that running away from her is a punishable offense, but she doesn't raise her voice and takes her calmly back home after the mission titled Disarm the Bomb. This would then encourage Anya to not associate her parents' love with her actions, but rather teach her about how her actions are what need to be corrected. When children start to conversely link their negative actions to their parents' moods, they become sneaky, people pleasers, or emulate that behavior with peers, and eventually engage in abusive relationships in the future. This is why it's crucial to treat child rearing like a mission, so that children can have the correct tools and environments to succeed by their own volition, as opposed to emotionally coercing them. Children are smart and can understand good from bad, which is why it's crucial that they understand that they can do bad independently from how a parent feels of their actions. So now that we established how attachment parenting is not the Loid Forger way, and how raising a child like an emotionally detached spy ensures a healthy childhood, what can we do to apply Loid Forger's tactics in our everyday lives? Fortunately, we don't have to be waterboarded while we try to meditate and pretend we're not dying. Instead, here are a few tips to go about our professional, private, and family lives the emotionally detached spy way. According to FBI agent Lorraine Key, a good place to start is to recognize the onsets of our own stress responses. If we're chilling and then all of a sudden we feel our heart rates increase, our palms sweat, or a pit in our stomach, it's a good time to rationalize our feelings. The first step to keeping cool is to recognize that we're on the verge of losing our composure because of brain chemicals. The more abstract and detached our reasoning for us losing composure, the more effective the strategy is, because it helps our brain rationalize that our emotional responses are automatic and mostly controlled by ourselves. The next thing we need to do once we've thought about how silly our own emotions are is to do the strategic pause. Instead of yelling at Anya for attempting to open your door and stumble upon your spy gear, take a pause before addressing her. This split second of time allows you to reset your emotional response and allows you to have a cold and calculated explanation as to why having your pistols exposed is a bad idea. And one final foolproof way to keep your cool and not draw any attention to yourself while you're impersonating someone else is to practice box breathing. Box breathing is the practice of inhaling for 4 seconds, holding in for 4, exhaling for 4, and holding your breath for 4 seconds before repeating the pattern. Though these tips aren't quite enough to get you into the Westalis counterintelligence program, they will allow you to regulate your emotions when your toddler spills the wine on the carpet, or when you have to kick the defining penalty in your Sunday league final. But alas, Anya may be a mischievous and difficult child to raise, but when the piece of Westalis and Ostania is in the balance, it's gonna take the best spy in Westalis to help that little girl have a happy and fulfilling life. Fortunately, the rest of us don't have to deal with that kind of pressure, so the least we can do is learn from Loid Forger and keep our negative emotions out from our kids' sights and help them accomplish their missions in grade school. So Godspeed, operators. The future's counting on you.